It began with a secret so absolute that even its makers could not speak its name in public. The aircraft that carried it was called the B-29 Superfortress, a machine of polished metal and paradox, the most expensive single piece of American engineering of its time, costing more in total than vast public works and entire naval programs. It was a vessel built to bridge the unimaginable, to fly farther, higher, and longer than any bomber before, to carry engines that breathed like beasts with turbochargers, to hold men inside a pressurized shell that felt, at times, like a small, isolated city. And into that city came an instrument of a new and terrible authority. This is the story of a flight inside a plane designed for a world that had not yet learned the limits of its power. This is the story of the men who walked into the pressurized cabin with maps, codes, and an unspoken question. How do you carry a decision that can end civilization? What does it do to the men and to the machine meant to deliver it? If you are not yet subscribed, consider joining this channel. The past is a repository of uneasy truths. We will return to them often. Subscribe quietly if you will and stay with us through what follows. Silence first. A long, deliberate silence. Not the absence of sound, but the containment of it. The hush of a hangar at dawn, the small clink of tools, the muffled conversation of mechanics who have learned to speak in seconds. Outside, the world was still rearranging itself after 6 years of war. Inside the hangar, technicians hunched over blueprints that read like future maps. Lines, tolerances, fuel loads, lift coefficients, words that promised distance and speed, and the peculiar arithmetic of fate. They called it Superfortress because it had to sound invulnerable. Yet vulnerability lurked in every innovation. Pressurized compartments that allowed a crew to work at altitudes where lungs would otherwise fail. Remote-controlled turrets, radar equipment, and a fuselage so vast it swallowed equipment and crew alike. The B-29 represented the pinnacle of wartime industrial imagination. It was a laboratory as much as an aircraft. It was also, by design, provisional, a machine built under duress, with parts and craftsmen stretched thin across factories that had never before attempted such orchestration. Who imagined, in those welding bays and test cells, that this airframe would carry into the sky not merely bombs, but the most consequential moral experiment in human history? Who, while fastening a rivet, considered that the cargo hold would one day bear a weapon whose name would not be uttered in polite company for decades? The story of the B-29 must begin in cost sheets and conference rooms, in sketches and endless wind tunnel runs. It must begin with men who read charts the way others read scripture, plotting ranges, payloads, and the thin margins where missions succeeded or failed. General Hap Arnold and a coterie of engineers demanded a bomber that could project power across the Pacific. The distances involved were obscene: islands, ocean, and a mainland nearly 5,000 miles away from the west coast. Existing aircraft could not meet the need. The B-29 was the answer: greater fuel capacity, more efficient engines, and the promise of pressurized crew modules to keep men alert for missions that would pilfer sleep and push human endurance. What kind of industry does it take to build such an aircraft? Imagine entire cities of manufacturing. Imagine thousands of workers piecing together aluminum, wiring, and glass into something that could fly. Factories in Wichita, in Renton, in Omaha humming like great mechanical lungs. Each B-29 required a web of suppliers, each supplier relied on another, and the whole chain was protected by urgency. Production drove innovation and improvisation at once. Shortages forced designers into improvisation, improvisation into risk, risk into procedures that bordered on ritual. But the B-29 was also born of strategy, a strategy that accepted the attrition of distance and the mechanics of strategic intimidation. It was a craft intended to strike at the heart of an island empire. It assumed a calculus. If shock and destruction could be concentrated at a single point, then perhaps a war could be ended without an invasion that would cost millions of lives. That calculus would be tested in ways its architects neither fully predicted nor, perhaps, fully desired. Yet machines alone do not create history. The B-29 required crews, pilots and navigators, bombardiers and flight engineers, radio operators and gunners. These were men drawn from disparate parts of America, trained under pressure, taught to translate abstract orders into precise, mechanical action. Training was a study in repetition and disbelief. They learned to trust instruments more than sensations, to fly through nights without stars, to read gauges that might as well have been the modern oracle. They learned, too, to maintain secrecy, to compartmentalize a mission's purpose even as their hands turned knobs and pulled levers. What does it mean to train for a mission you cannot speak about? How do men prepare for consequences they cannot name? The answer lies in routine, takeoffs practiced until lethargy, approaches rehearsed until muscle memory suffocated fear. The B-29's crews were specialists in endurance. They flew missions that demanded extended focus, that tested the limits of human concentration and engineering reliability. Training flights stretched for hours, crews sleeping in shifts, eyes fighting the fatigue that time zone leaps induce. They learned the odd intimacy of a crew that lives in a sealed metal world for a night. Jokes whisper into oxygen masks. Confidences are traded like batteries. Despair, if it arrives, is tucked away. As training intensified, so too did the awareness of the aircraft's fragilities. Engines overheated. Propellers vibrated with indeterminate rhythms. Pressurization could fail like a betrayed promise. Each new fault required a fix, and each fix demanded courage in the face of complexity. The men who climbed into the B-29s were not, for the most part, philosophers. They were technicians of habit, of checklist, of repetition. But even technicians must sometimes confront the moral weight of what they serve. In late 1944 and early 1945, the B-29 program reached a peculiar velocity. Superfortresses began the arduous task of moving men and munitions from bases in the Marianas to targets in the Japanese home islands. Those missions were long and dangerous. Night after night, the Pacific stretched below like a black wound. Anti-aircraft fire carved the sky. Enemy fighters tested formations. Crews who had once believed themselves invulnerable discovered otherwise. The B-29s, despite their name, began to take losses. And then there was a change not made by engineers but by planners. A campaign of low-altitude incendiary raids using new tactics and new ordnance. Conventional weapons, deployed with terrible efficiency, produced firestorms that consumed whole districts of Japanese cities. The moral calculus of strategic bombing loosened into a calculus of devastation. Whole neighborhoods burned. Civilians perished by the thousands. The logic of war, that old arithmetic of ends and means, revealed its capacity for escalation. Into this landscape of ash and calculation stepped another choice. The Manhattan Project, that vast industrial secret, had succeeded in producing a weapon born of splitting the atom. Scientists who had pursued knowledge found themselves adjacent to an instrument whose purpose was immediate and brutal. Military planners debated its use with a mixture of urgency and abstraction. The atom bomb was no ordinary ordnance, it was an ethical rupture. Was the B-29 built to carry such a device? Not originally. No blueprint anticipated a cargo that would, on detonation, alter the chemistry of a city and the future of warfare. Yet the B-29's range, payload, and the ability to operate at high altitude made it the plausible delivery system. Conversions were engineered in secrecy. Special bomb bays modified, mounting devices contrived, testing of release mechanisms conducted under layers of classification. Men who had never before experienced the particular terror of a new weapon found themselves learning its geometry. Weight, balance, release timing. Who were the men who installed these devices? They were ordnance technicians from branches of service assigned to a mission whose contours they only half understood. They dealt with explosive physics the way masons deal with mortar. With measurement, care, and a professional distance. Yet even professional distance can fray. Late-night conversations in lonely Pacific outposts recorded apprehensions and questions. Not all of them were answered. Not all could be answered. We must ask, finally, what does it mean to prepare for an action that will rewrite the scale of human suffering? How does a crew reconcile the immediate tactile work of flight, trimming flaps, adjusting engine mixture, reading altimeters, with the abstract, delayed violence that their mission might produce? The answer is not singular. For some, duty eclipsed doubt. For others, the ritual of the mission furnished a moral insulation. Many professed only the language of orders. Some asked questions that could not be spoken aloud. All of them, in boarding the Superfortress on that morning that would come to define an era, carried a private ledger of fear and hope. The B-29, for all its metal and math, was now more than a plane. It was a hinge. Its wings would carry not only ordnance but a future that hung on a single decision. The men who pushed it down runways, who watched its compass needles weave, were about to be entrusted with an action whose consequences would outpace their training. What would you have thought if you were there? If you looked at the instrument panel and then at the small, folded photograph of a loved one glued to the bulkhead, would the photograph feel like an anchor or an accusation? These are the questions that followed men into the cockpit and that haunt the empty hangars still. The context is set. The machine exists. The crews have been forged. The moral lever is in the hands of committees and commanders. What follows is not inevitable. It is the product of decisions that combine technical constraint, political urgency, and human frailty. In the next installment, we will move from the long apprenticeship of testing and training into the first arcs of rising action. The missions that shaped doctrine, the failures that forced improvisation, and the slow narrowing of possibility that would culminate in 2 flights no one would forget. Continue with us. Subscribe to the channel if you want to follow the rest of this reconstruction. In the next segment, we will trace the mechanics of conversion, how an aircraft became the vessel for atomic terror, and the men who learned to release a weapon none of them had expected to use. What errors were made in laboratories and in mines? What assumptions proved fatal? Who paid and who decided? These questions will not be answered lightly. By early 1945, the Pacific was no longer a battlefield of armies, it was a test field of endurance. The B-29 Superfortress had become the long arm of American air power, reaching across oceans and into the heart of Japan. Yet for every mission completed, there were dozens that ended in failure. Engines lost, crews missing, machines disintegrated in the air. The aircraft that symbolized progress was, at times, a fragile experiment in flight. The technical limits of the B-29 were merciless. Its right R-3350 engines, masterpieces on paper, were unpredictable in practice. They ran hot too hot. Bearings seized, exhaust valves failed, fires ignited without warning. The crews called them time bombs bolted to wings. Engineers struggled to tame them, redesigning ducts, adjusting cowl flaps, altering fuel mixtures. But the reality was that each mission carried a margin of luck. Inside the pressurized cabin, the crew often felt the aircraft's mood before the gauges revealed it. A faint vibration could signal a runaway temperature. A smell of oil might mean a slow disaster. They learned to listen as much as to read. The United States had created a flying fortress that could theoretically reach any target on Earth, but the human cost of mastering it was high. The 58th Bomb Wing lost more aircraft to mechanical failure than to enemy fire. Training squadrons buried men who had never seen combat. And yet the work continued, driven by the conviction that endurance itself was victory. It was during this period that another secret project, far away from the Pacific, was approaching its own dreadful maturity. In New Mexico, in Tennessee, in the quiet laboratory towns that did not appear on maps, the Manhattan Project gathered its final components. Scientists, soldiers, and engineers worked in separate compartments, each knowing little of the whole. To them, the B-29 was a curiosity, a delivery system waiting for a cargo no one dared describe aloud. At the same time, in Washington and Los Alamos, plans were forming to create a dedicated unit, one that would exist outside the normal chain of command, its orders sealed. The designation was simple: the 509th Composite Group. It would train in isolation for a single mission whose objective was known only to a handful of men. The 509th was commanded by Colonel Paul Tibbets, a pilot already known for precision and an almost clinical composure under pressure. He was young, efficient, and loyal to a vision of victory defined by results. His assignment: to form a team capable of delivering a weapon unlike any other in existence. They trained at Wendover Field in Utah, a place so barren that it was chosen precisely for its emptiness. The desert swallowed sound. The mountains at the horizon seemed to hold their breath. There, Tibbets and his men drilled relentlessly: navigation, altitude control, bomb release, fuel management. But the bomb they were preparing for did not yet exist in usable form. They practiced with steel casings, weighted to approximate the mass of the device. To most of the crew it was just another secret test. Orders came with a language of indirection. Special ordnance. Unusual payload. Top priority. Few asked for explanations, fewer received them. Some men guessed. A few scientists visiting the base carried themselves with the distracted air of those who had glimpsed something profound and unsettling. Rumors circulated, of new physics, of a weapon that might end the war in a single stroke. But speculation in wartime is noise. The crews focused on what they could control: altitude, timing, survival. And yet, how do you train men for an act that no one has yet defined? For a mission that has no precedent, no moral vocabulary? Tibbetts' leadership style was methodical, almost antiseptic. He believed in eliminating uncertainty through discipline. He forbade gossip, restricted access, and demanded perfection in every simulation. If we do it right, he told his men, there will be no second mission. They did not know what he meant, not fully. But the tone of inevitability hung in the air like static. The B-29s assigned to the 509th were different. Stripped of defensive armament to reduce weight, polished to a dull silver that reflected the desert light, and modified with reinforced bomb bays, they were machines prepared for a purpose not yet spoken. The airframes received special designation numbers. One of them, serial 44 to 86,292, would later bear a name chosen by Tibbetts himself, Enola Gay, after his mother. By July 1945, the war in Europe was over. In the Pacific, Japan stood isolated but unbroken. The American military prepared for an invasion of the Japanese home islands, an operation projected to cost hundreds of thousands of lives. Simultaneously, another plan was reaching its final stage. In the desert of New Mexico, the first atomic device was assembled. It was called the Gadget. Its test was scheduled for July 16, 1945. Those who witnessed it would remember a light that erased shadow and language. The shockwave rolled across the Jornada del Muerto Valley, flattening sagebrush, rattling distant windows, and marking the dawn of a new epoch. One scientist whispered a line from scripture, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Others stood in silence, unable to comprehend what they had unleashed. Thousands of miles away at Tinian Island in the Pacific, the men of the 509th continued their routines, briefings, mechanical inspections, drills. They knew something was coming. The atmosphere changed, imperceptibly at first, then unmistakably. The arrival of special crates sealed in wood and guarded by armed sentries confirmed it. The atomic bombs arrived in parts, escorted by intelligence officers. 2 designs, one uranium-based, codenamed Little Boy, and one plutonium-based, Fat Man. The work of years delivered in silence. Technicians assembled them inside air-conditioned huts, under armed watch. Every bolt, every wire, was documented with obsessive precision. A single error could mean catastrophe. Tibbetts and his chosen crew received new instructions. The mission would be carried out soon. They were told little about the weapon's nature, only that it was powerful beyond comparison and that their flight must succeed. Every detail was rehearsed: takeoff timing, altitude, bomb release, the precise maneuver to escape the blast. On August 5, 1945, the night before the mission, Enola Gay stood ready on the runway at North Field, its aluminum skin glinting under floodlights. Ground crews worked through the night. The bomb bay was loaded. The air smelled of metal and rain. At 2:30 a.m., the crew assembled for briefing. Maps were spread, targets named: Hiroshima, Kokura, Nagasaki, Niigata. The primary was Hiroshima, a city of military depots, shipyards, and, inevitably, civilians. Weather reconnaissance confirmed clear skies. The order was sealed. Each man was issued a cyanide capsule, a grim token in case of capture. None spoke of it. Tibbetts told them to expect turbulence and to remember procedures. The tone was detached, procedural, almost routine. But everyone understood, even if they could not articulate it. History was about to shift course. At dawn, Enola Gay began its roll. The engines roared, straining against weight and gravity. The plane lifted, heavy but certain. The Pacific stretched beneath, calm and indifferent. Ahead, Japan awaited, unaware, unready. What went through their minds as the horizon brightened? Did any of them wonder what the world would look like after the bomb fell? Did they imagine the faces of those below, or did they fix their eyes on instruments, finding comfort in dials and data? 4 hours, the aircraft climbed and cruised in silence, its crew enclosed in a world of oxygen masks and mechanical murmurs. The planet turned below, oblivious. The target came into view shortly after 8 a.m., Hiroshima, a city nestled among rivers, alive with morning routines. Children on their way to school. Factory whistles. The ordinary rhythm of life in a nation at war. At 8:15 a.m., the bomb bay doors opened. The release was clean, almost delicate. The weapon dropped away, tumbling for 43 seconds before detonation. In that instant, daylight became something else, a fusion of physics and finality. A sphere of fire erupted, brighter than the sun, expanding with the force of centuries of compressed energy. The city dissolved into flame and wind. Shadows burned into walls. Water boiled in rivers. Tens of thousands died before sound reached them. From the cockpit, the crew saw the cloud rise, a living thing, a column twisting into the stratosphere. The shockwave struck moments later, jolting the plane. Some shouted. Others fell silent. No one spoke of victory. Only astonishment and something darker, unspoken. As the Enola gate turned away, the city behind them was gone. Where once there were streets and bridges, there was a wound in the earth. They flew home in silence. The mission log recorded the essential facts. Takeoff, release, return. Nothing more. No mention of screams or fire. History at first was written in numbers. Back on Tinian, Tibbets and his crew were congratulated, photographed, and debriefed. Messages of success arrived. Yet even in the relief of completion, there lingered a question none dared voice. Had they done the right thing? The war would end within days. But the silence that followed was heavier than any celebration. When you drop a weapon that can end wars, what else do you end? The next part of this story follows the echo, the second mission, the spread of knowledge, and the dawning realization that mankind had crossed a threshold it could never retreat from. Stay with us. Subscribe if you haven't already, to witness how the Superfortress became not just a machine of war, but the engine of a new and uncertain age. 3 days after Hiroshima, the world had not yet absorbed what had happened. Communications were fragmented, reports contradictory. Japan's government oscillated between disbelief and paralysis. To the American command on Tinian, however, the message was clear. Proceed with the next mission. The second bomb was ready. Its code name was Fat Man, a heavier, more complex weapon using a plutonium core compressed by explosive lenses. Where Little Boy had been a relatively simple gun-type device, this one represented an entirely new frontier of engineering. It was also, in every sense, an experiment. Even the scientists who built it were unsure of its efficiency. Would it detonate as planned or fail midair? Would it release the same apocalyptic fire or something worse? On August 9, 1945, the B-29 boxcar lifted from the runway at Tinian under the command of Major Charles Sweeney. Its flight plan mirrored that of the previous mission: altitude, checkpoints, rendezvous. But the morning was fraught with mishaps. One of the fuel transfer pumps malfunctioned, limiting the aircraft's range. Clouds covered Kokura, the primary target. As they circled, flak and smoke obscured visibility further. Each minute burned precious fuel. Sweeney turned toward the secondary target, Nagasaki. The city was partially shielded by clouds, but a brief opening revealed the urban center. At 11:02 a.m. the bomb was released. It detonated in the Urakami Valley, between the hills that trapped its shockwave and magnified its destruction. What followed was not a flash but a thunderclap of existence itself, a radiance so intense that metal vaporized, stone melted, and flesh ceased to distinguish itself from air. Some died instantly. Others stumbled through burning streets, skin turned to ash. Those who survived the initial blast would live to know a slower kind of death: radiation, illness, the unending collapse of the body's invisible defenses. Within seconds, 70,000 lives were erased or condemned. And yet even then, the mission reports remained dispassionate. Bombing results, excellent. Numbers in place of grief. Data instead of sorrow. When boxcar landed at Okinawa, it was nearly out of fuel. The crew barely made it back. They were exhausted, dehydrated, silent. Behind them, 2 cities had been transformed into cauterized voids. The immediate military result was undeniable. Japan's ability to continue resistance was shattered. On August 15, Emperor Hirohito's voice, the first his subjects had ever heard, crackled over the radio, announcing surrender. His tone was formal, subdued, almost otherworldly. He spoke of enduring the unendurable. For the first time in modern history, the machinery of war stopped because humanity had looked too far into its own potential. In America, jubilation erupted. Parades, headlines, confetti. The war was over. The bombs were hailed as the instruments of peace. President Truman called them a reign of ruin that had saved countless lives by preventing invasion. Most citizens accepted this narrative. They wanted to believe that victory had been achieved at the least possible cost. Few understood what had been unleashed in their name. For the men of the 509th, the celebrations felt distant. Some were granted leave, others sent for debriefings. Their photos appeared in newspapers, framed as heroes. Yet many avoided the word. In private letters, fragments of disquiet appeared, a sentence here, a hesitation there. We did what we were told. It was necessary. I can't forget the light. Paul Tibbets himself never expressed regret. He insisted the mission had ended the war, saved lives, and justified the years of effort. But others in his unit, and many of the scientists who built the bomb, began to fracture under the moral weight of their creation. Robert Oppenheimer, once the intellectual core of the Manhattan Project, was haunted by the image of the desert test. He spoke publicly of guilt, of responsibility, of the terrible knowledge that mankind had entered a domain it could not leave. Physicists have known sin, he said, and in that simple phrase an entire generation of scientists felt the echo of remorse. In Tokyo, amidst the ruins, Allied teams documented the devastation. What they found defied language. Streets fused into glass. Buildings vaporized, their foundations etched like shadows. Human silhouettes burned into stone walls. Doctors faced wounds they could not categorize. Skin sloughed from bodies days after exposure. Children with burns shaped like the patterns of their kimonos. Some of those children survived. They grew into adults who would carry the name Hibakusha, survivors of the explosion. Their existence would become the living record of atomic consequence. Even among American officials, doubt began to whisper. Admiral William Leahy, Truman's chief of staff, wrote that using the bomb was a barbarous weapon, that in destroying civilians wholesale, the United States had adopted the ethics of the very enemies it sought to defeat. General Eisenhower privately confessed that he had opposed its use, believing Japan was already on the brink of surrender. Yet the machine of history, once set in motion, cannot be easily reversed. What does it mean to win a war at such cost? When victory demands innocence as tribute, does it still count as victory? The B-29 Superfortress returned to its hangars. Some were scrapped, others repurposed, a few preserved as relics. But their legacy could not be dismantled so easily. They had not only delivered the most destructive weapons in history, they had inaugurated a new kind of power, the capacity to end civilization with machinery alone. The atomic age had begun not with a declaration, but with a flight log. In the months that followed, secrecy persisted. The photographs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were censored, the full extent of radiation sickness concealed from the public. Scientists who tried to warn of its effects were silenced or ignored. The narrative remained clean: the bomb ended the war. But history, like fallout, settles slowly. In the ashes of two cities, a new kind of warfare was already being imagined. Engineers and generals studied the blast data, measuring destruction as if it were an equation to be solved. Laboratories in America, Britain, and the Soviet Union began their own atomic programs. Deterrence became doctrine. Fear became strategy. The B-29, that shining emblem of industrial might, became the first messenger of a darker future, a future in which victory and annihilation shared the same machinery. And so, even as the wreckage was cleared, the world did not return to peace. It entered a colder kind of war, fought not for land but for supremacy of fear. Did the men of the 509th understand that they had opened a door that could never close? Or did they see themselves only as soldiers completing a mission? Perhaps both are true. Perhaps that is what makes this story endure, because it was never just about machines or missions, but about the thin line between duty and consequence. When the Enola Gay was placed in storage after the war, it sat quietly for years, its aluminum skin dull with dust. To some it was a relic of triumph. To others, a monument to tragedy. Museums argued over how to display it, as a weapon, a warning, or an artifact of history. Every rivet, every dent, every shadow in its fuselage carried a question that has not yet been answered. Was it necessary? In the next part, we descend into the aftermath, the human cost, the silence that followed, and the long debate that would shape not just nations but the soul of modern warfare. If you wish to understand what came after the smoke cleared, not just what was destroyed but what was created in its place, stay with us. Subscribe and continue down the corridor of history that began inside a polished silver aircraft called the Superfortress. In the aftermath of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, silence spread faster than the radiation itself. For days, weeks, then months, the world did not know how to speak about what had happened. Governments issued statements, newspapers printed triumph, but beneath the official language, A deep unease began to form, one that would grow into the central anxiety of the modern age. In the ruins of Hiroshima, the landscape no longer resembled a city. It was as though the earth had been peeled open. Miles of devastation, scorched, flattened, sterile. Bodies fused to the ground, entire neighborhoods erased without a trace. Even the rivers ran black with ash. Survivors wandered through the skeletal remains, searching for voices that would never answer. Some carried the burned bodies of loved ones. Others, too weak to cry, simply kept walking. Doctors and nurses arrived from nearby towns. Many of them soon fell ill themselves. The wounds they encountered did not behave like any they had seen before. Burns that deepened after days, skin that sloughed off in sheets, fevers without pattern, bleeding from pores, hair falling in clumps. No one understood it yet, but the invisible element of the weapon, radiation, had begun its slow and merciless work. In Nagasaki the pattern repeated. Hospitals overflowed with the living and the dying, indistinguishable. The smell of charred flesh hung in the air for weeks. Priests wandered through the ruins giving last rites to the unrecognizable. Children cried for water that could no longer be found. American occupation forces arrived soon after Japan's surrender. Their first orders were not to assist the wounded but to document. Teams of scientists, photographers, and officers surveyed the destruction with clipboards and cameras. They measured blast radius, heat dispersion, structural collapse. Every ruin became a data point. Every corpse a statistic. For the survivors, the hibakusha, this was another kind of cruelty, to be studied but not saved. Many lived in exile within their own country, stigmatized for carrying an invisible contamination. Few would ever speak publicly of what they endured. When they did, their voices were often dismissed as inconvenient to the new narrative of peace through power. Back in the United States, that narrative hardened into national pride. The bomb was celebrated as a symbol of progress, the ultimate proof of American ingenuity. Hollywood made films that glorified the atomic scientist. Posters declared the dawn of a new age. Children in classrooms learned that the bomb had saved lives, that it was the instrument of liberation. But within the laboratories, among the men who had built it, there was no celebration, only reckoning. Oppenheimer became the reluctant prophet of remorse. He saw what others refused to see, that humanity had crossed a moral boundary it could not retreat from. The physicists have known sin, he said, and in that sentence, science lost its innocence. In Washington, the military saw something different, potential. If one bomb could end a war, then more bombs could prevent another. Deterrence became doctrine. Fear became a policy. The logic was simple. No one would attack a nation capable of absolute destruction. It was a strategy built not on faith but on terror. By 1946, new projects began under new names. Oak Ridge, Hanford, Los Alamos. The same places that had built Little Boy and Fat Man now worked toward hydrogen, fusion, and yield. The machinery of Armageddon was expanding, automated, bureaucratized. Scientists who had once spoken of peace now discussed megatons and delivery systems. The B-29, still flying in training commands, was soon replaced by jet bombers capable of carrying heavier and deadlier payloads. The weapon had outgrown its cradle. Yet the ethical debate refused to die. In secret reports and private letters, generals and philosophers wrestled with the same question. Was the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki an act of necessity, or an atrocity rationalized by victory? The Frank Report, written months before the bombs fell, had warned against their use. The United States, it said, will lose the moral leadership of mankind if we introduce atomic bombs as instruments of warfare. That warning was ignored. But its words would return, echoed in the conscience of generations. In the post-war years, testimony from Japanese doctors and survivors began to filter westward. Journalists smuggled photographs of shadows burned into pavement, of children whose bodies bore the map of atomic light. Censors tried to suppress them, but images have a way of finding their audience. And when they did, the illusion of a clean victory fractured. How does a civilization justify the suffering of innocents for the promise of peace? Can morality survive the logic of total war? Some argued it could. Others said it already had it. The B-29s that had delivered the bombs were quietly retired. Their crews returned to ordinary lives. Pilots became instructors or businessmen. Engineers went home to quiet suburbs. But memory does not obey orders. The sound of the engines, the glow of that impossible light, They followed the men into their sleep. Decades later, some would speak of recurring dreams, falling, burning, silence. As the Cold War deepened, the lessons of the B-29 were absorbed into a new generation of machines. The B-36, the B-47, and eventually the B-52, all descendants of the Superfortress, all designed for one purpose: to carry civilization's shadow on their wings. In a sense, the B-29 was not just the parent of nuclear delivery systems, it was the blueprint for the psychological architecture of the nuclear age. A world where fear became equilibrium, and annihilation became stability. In Japan, reconstruction began amid the ruins. Cities were rebuilt, factories reopened, lives resumed. But under the surface, radiation sickness continued to claim victims. Children were born with deformities. Survivors struggled with cancers whose causes were whispered but rarely spoken aloud. Memorials rose, stone arches, quiet parks, eternal flames. Each year, on August 6th and August 9th, the cities paused to remember. Bells tolled. Paper lanterns floated down rivers that had once boiled. The silence of remembrance replaced the silence of shock. Meanwhile, in Washington, the Enola Gay sat dismantled in a storage hangar. Its parts labeled and crated, awaiting a decision that would take decades. When the Smithsonian Institution proposed to display it in the 1990s, public debate erupted once more. Veterans groups demanded that it be shown as a symbol of triumph. Historians insisted it must also acknowledge the suffering it caused. The conflict was not just about a plane, it was about how a nation remembers itself. Is history written by victors or by witnesses? And can the two ever truly agree? In the end, the exhibit opened in partial compromise. The fuselage of the Enola Gay gleamed under museum lights, polished, immaculate, detached from its context. Visitors gazed at it as one might at a fossil of some extinct creature, beautiful and terrible. Few lingered long. Some took photographs. Some walked away in silence. What remains of a machine after its purpose is fulfilled? Metal and memory. And sometimes memory is heavier. The B-29 was conceived as the pinnacle of human ingenuity, and it was. But ingenuity without restraint can become something else entirely. It can become the bridge between civilization and catastrophe. The atomic bomb did not simply end a war, it began an era. An era in which humanity lives under its own shadow, where progress and peril march side by side. And yet, even now, more than 70 years later, nations still measure power in kilotons and missile ranges. Scientists still build weapons in the name of deterrence. The lesson of the B-29 remains both learned and ignored. Have we truly changed? Or have we merely built quieter, faster, more sophisticated versions of the same machine, still believing that control equals safety? In the final part, we return to where it began. The idea of power, the illusion of mastery, and the question that haunted the cockpit of the Enola Gay as it turned toward home. What is progress when it leads to silence? Stay with us for the conclusion. Subscribe if you wish to follow the closing reflection, the moment where history meets its mirror, and where the sky itself remembers what humanity tried to forget. In the years that followed, the world learned to live beneath an invisible sky, one that could ignite at any moment. The atomic age had no front lines, only potential endings. Diplomats called it balance, historians, deterrence. Ordinary people simply called it fear. The B-29 Superfortress, once the pinnacle of wartime ambition, faded into history books, museum halls, and black and white footage. But the shadow it cast, the moral, scientific, and existential shadow, only grew longer with time. For the men who had built it, the pride of creation slowly mixed with the bitterness of consequence. Engineers who once marveled at its altitude and range began to question the destination it had made possible. We proved what men could do, one designer recalled decades later, but not what they should do. By the 1950s, the skies were filled with its descendants, faster, stronger, more autonomous. The Cold War demanded them. Bombers now carried not a single weapon but many, not a decision but an arsenal. The doctrines of mutual assured destruction turned logic itself into a hostage. Peace, it seemed, depended on the constant readiness to end everything. And through it all, the B-29 remained the first messenger of this paradox. A machine that had ended one war by ensuring the possibility of every future one. In Hiroshima, survivors told their stories to whoever would listen. Some spoke softly, some in anger, some simply to remember before they were gone. Schoolchildren gathered in Peace Park, folding paper cranes in memory of Sadako Sasaki, the young girl who had died of leukemia years after the bombing. Each crane was a fragile prayer, not for revenge but for comprehension. The hibakusha grew old under a peace they could never fully trust. For them, the past was not history, it was weather, something that never truly cleared. They became living reminders of what happens when technology outpaces conscience. Meanwhile, nations that had once condemned the bomb now sought their own. The Soviet Union tested its first device in 1949. Britain followed, then France, then China. Each test echoed across deserts and oceans, as if the Earth itself were being forced to remember. The skies that had once belonged to the superfortress now belonged to an equation: speed, altitude, payload, deterrence. The race was no longer for victory but for survival through threat. What began as a single flight from Tinian Island had become a world system. The B-29 was the hinge between the old war and the new peace, a peace that depended not on treaties, but on terror held in check by calculation. And yet, in a strange irony, that same machine also became the vessel for hope. When the Cold War ended, the Enola Gay was restored, piece, by men who had not been born when it flew. They polished its skin, reattached its wings, rebuilt its cockpit from fragments. It became again whole, but it would never again fly. Standing beneath it in the Smithsonian's Air and Space Museum, visitors see not a weapon but a mirror. They see themselves reflected in the metal. The same ingenuity, the same ambition, the same capacity for both creation and destruction. Children press their hands to its surface. Veterans stare in silence. Historians whisper to one another about context and consequence. And somewhere in that vast, echoing hall, the hum of air conditioning sounds almost like an idling engine. Progress has always carried a double edge. The same hands that build can destroy, the same vision that reaches for the stars can scorch the ground. The B-29 was not a monster. It was a human achievement, which makes its legacy all the more haunting. Because if a machine is only as moral as the purpose it serves, then the superfortress stands as both proof of our genius and a warning of our blindness. Every age believes it can control its power. Every generation tells itself that its weapons are deterrents, not destinies. But history whispers otherwise. From the silver runways of Tinian to the glow of mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, from the desert test sites to the quiet control rooms of the Cold War, one truth endures. We are still flying inside the same metaphorical aircraft, still cruising at high altitude above the line that separates knowledge from wisdom. The difference now is scale. Where once a single plane carried a single bomb, today entire systems carry thousands. Where once men pulled levers by hand, now circuits make decisions in milliseconds. The logic has grown more efficient but not more humane. Perhaps that is what makes the B-29 story timeless. It is not just about technology or warfare, but about the perpetual human temptation to believe that mastery over nature grants mastery over consequence. We like to imagine that history moves forward, that progress is a line, not a loop. But every generation builds its own superfortress, convinced that this time it will be different. And yet, the question remains, the same question that haunted the first crew as they watched the city vanish beneath them. What have we done and what will we do next? In that question lies the weight of all our inventions, the sum of our ambitions, and the silence that follows every explosion. The B-29 Superfortress changed the world not only because of what it destroyed, but because of what it revealed, that in the heart of human progress lies a contradiction we have yet to resolve. The story ends where it began, in silence. Not the silence of victory nor of defeat, but the silence of understanding. And if you listen closely beneath that silence, you might still hear the faint echo of engines climbing toward the dawn, carrying not bombs, but a question that refuses to die. Before you go, if this journey through history has made you think, if it has stirred questions that don't leave easily, consider subscribing. Here we return to the forgotten corners of the past, not to glorify but to understand. Because history, like flight, demands perspective. And sometimes, to see the truth, you must rise above the clouds and look down upon what was once unthinkable. This is the story of the B-29, the aircraft that carried the bomb nobody was ready for. And the shadow it casts still stretches across the sky we all live under.